Hi there YouTube, this is the Magnus, bringing you part 2 of my competitive multiplayer guide for Total War Warhammer. Today we're going to be looking specifically at the deployment phase. Now, considering you may only have a minute in this phase, it may seem at first blush that there isn't a whole lot to be done or a whole lot that needs to be considered, but nothing could be further from the truth. So I'm just going to walk you through the things that I do during the deployment phase that I think help set me up for success. Now, the first thing I do is what I call the cheese check. The cheese check is when you go up to the balance of power bar here. And again, in a multiplayer battle, I'm not going to be able to see this, right? I have no idea what my opponent has or where it's going to deploy. So when I look up here, I can see how many troops I have on the field, but I can also see how many my enemy has. Now, this is useful in checking to see if you're playing against an opponent that's bringing a cheese build. For example, if he's the dwarfs and you go up there and it says he has 34 troops, you know he brought a bunch of gyrocopters and generally one lord and 2 heroes, and you're going to be dealing with gyrocopter spam. And that's going to allow you to better position your troops, knowing okay, he's gyrocopter spamming, or if he has an inordinately large amount of troops as the vampires, okay, he must be spamming a bunch of zombies, for example. And just looking at the overall size of the army is also going to tell you if his army's a lot smaller than yours, he's either bringing a lot of heroes, maybe a lot of artillery. If he's a faction that doesn't have those things or doesn't use them a lot, it may mean he brought very high quality units. So if you're against Chaos, he has a very small army, expect giants, expect him to have used a lot of single entity units or high-end things like Chaos spawns or Chosen with great weapons, things like that. So there's a lot that can be gleaned just from the number here. The other thing it's going to allow you to do is, if he has a very small army, you can expect the width of his line to not be very broad, whereas if he has a large army, you could end up needing to stretch out quite a bit. So I usually hit Control A, and then I just right-click back so that all my guys are back here, so when I'm deploying up front, they're not in my way. The other thing that I notice right away is I take a look at the terrain. And after a while, you'll have the maps pretty well memorized, and you'll know whether there's considerable terrain or if it's like this, a much more plain map where terrain doesn't play a huge effect. But if there's trees, forests, things of that nature, there's places he can hide cav, there's places you can hide cav or other units, and that needs to be considered. The other thing is, if he has a big hill on his side, you can pretty much be sure that your opponent's probably going to try to use that to their advantage. If you have it on your side, you should consider doing so if you have ranged artillery, things like that, that are able to force him or make it much more likely for your opponent to have to bring it to you. So, barring all of those things, and considering the composition of the opponent, the cheese check, and what information that gives us, terrain, we then really want to focus on our own army. So if we know he has a pretty small line, for example, we can get away with doing more of a double line. And one way I like to do that is put my stronger stuff up first, and then I go ahead and stretch that out. And then I'll put 2 of my weaker anti-cav type infantry in reserve. That way, when he brings his cav at me, if he comes to the front, I can move them up to support. If he comes around the side, it's a lot easier to get them over there. And you keep this kind of a distance between them, because if your opponent has artillery or missiles, the last thing you want to do is help him out by clustering your units together. Now, if I was facing an opponent that I expected to have a larger line, then I'll probably put everything on the front line and just do something like this. So I just drag and stretch it out. You can use the arrows to move it around, try to get it centered with your opponent. Now with missiles, you have a couple of choices. You can start them off immediately behind the line, which is a more defensive position because you're not exposing your missiles. These guys have Vanguard, so I don't have to move my front line back. I can just put them out in front like that. This is much more aggressive. And generally what you'll see people do, or a decent amount of people, is they'll have them up here, the enemy will advance, and when they get too close, they'll pull their missiles back. Well, the thing I don't like about that is, first of all, you've got guys coming back, so it's going to be a lot harder to get the charge off with your infantry. Second of all, that entire time, you have your back turned to your enemy and you're not firing because you're moving, and you're not facing your opponent. So generally what I prefer to do with a missile line like this is to pull my infantry forward. Now this is much more applicable with archers, crossbows, bowmen, things like that, because they can shoot over your troops. Now in the case of these guys, Free Company Militia or handgunners, they're not as good at that. But there is a workaround to be able to use them in a similar fashion, and that is to take your infantry line and do things a little differently. So we're going to move it back here for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to pair them up in groups of 2, 1, you know, whatever works for you. And we're going to make them a little more narrow. This. And like that. And like this. And like that. And we're just going to leave little gaps here. And then what you can do is you can line these guys up with the gaps. So maybe put them like that. These guys here. We're going to move this one over here. And maybe we put one of them out on the flank. If he'll listen to me. Come on over here. There we go. So what's going to happen is when I pull my infantry through ahead of these guys, when his infantry are dangerously close, I countercharge. And then these guys are positioned. This one can go out on the flank and shoot. And the other ones are able to shoot through the gap that's in your infantry and hit in either direction towards the opponent's infantry. And again, you really only have to do that with the missiles or artillery that don't shoot over your guys, that they're not able to, and it's going to get obscured. But that's a creative little workaround that I've found works well. With your cavalry, you really have 2 primary choices and then a lot more from there. And that is, you can use your cav and put them in an offensive position, which is out on the flanks and some distance between your line. This you generally want to do when you expect yourself to have the cavalry advantage, aka you'll have more cav and or better cav, or he'll have none at all. If that's your expectation, you want to take that aggressive posture, especially if you plan on advancing at one point or another. The more middle of the road is to bring them in like this, so that they're on the edge, but they're not far from your infantry. That way your spearmen can come over and support if need be. And this is a more defensive posture with your cavalry. It also keeps them over there to try to help prevent anything working its way around your main infantry line, because you can intercept. And again, you can call in infantry to support you in that fight, or use your range to shoot at it. The third way that you can use them is extremely defensive, which is for protecting missiles, key units, casters, things that are soft, not very strong, and that you really need to protect. And you can use them that way. And you still have the ability to fight off flankers and other cavalry, but you also have the ability to rush in if flying units come up or he breaks through your line. This is a very defensive way to use your cav. The last way I'll mention, not that there aren't others, is to go overload, which is where you put all of your cav on one side, or the majority of it, to create a situation where you are going to win the cav engagement on that side, and then try to use infantry or something else to protect your other flank. All of these are viable. I prefer either aggressive stance or defensive stance. I rarely put them back here. I rarely overload, but they are viable ways of going about things. As far as your missiles, again, you can place them in a defensive or an offensive position. And if they can shoot over your guys, you don't have to break them up this way and put gaps in your infantry line. But what I do recommend is don't take your missiles and just do this. Okay? What's bad about this? Well, what's bad about it is if he charges in with something like Cav, right? There's a good chance he's going to be able to hit in both of these units and prevent both of them from being able to fire. That's extremely unattractive. You're much better off going with something like this. So you still want to stay behind your infantry line, but you create enough space between your guys that they're not going to get hit by one unit, right? He's going to have to send one after this, one after that, or go after them in order. But he's not going to get a 2-for-1 deal or a 3-for-1 deal. Now, you've probably been wondering why you may have been wondering why a lot of people, most people, stretch their infantry out this way. Well, there's two primary reasons for doing that. One is that you are going to have as much hitting power as possible, meaning that you're going to have as many guys in that front line because it's as long as possible, so more guys are swinging at one time. The other reason for it is that if you go head to head with one other unit, they're not going to wrap around, meaning if his unit's wider than yours because you do something more like this, right, and he does this, his guys are going to wrap around when they attack and get a surround on your unit, which is a very bad thing. The other reason for doing it is artillery and missiles are not going to be as effective shooting into a thin line like this as they would be to a blob line like that, right? Now with missiles, if your opponent is unlikely or does not have missiles or artillery, it may be better to go with a less wide rank. Reason being is you've made yourself a smaller target, sure, but the other reason is when you move missile units or give an attack order, they will kind of snake their way around to the left or right, and it takes them a long time to move. Whereas the closer they are to being a square, they'll be able to reposition themselves much quicker, and that can be a benefit to you as well. Flying units, because they're flying, you can put them right over other units, you can put them up front, you can hide them in the back. Generally, if you're bringing flying units, you're going to want to have them in a more aggressive posture. Just make sure it's not in front of like artillery or something that might shoot them. And this is going to allow you to more quickly get out there and engage, scout, and do the different things you want to do with them. However, if you feel right out the gate in the deployment phase that you are going to be weaker in flying than your opponent, you're better off putting them back where your missiles can support them. And note the range of your missiles and keep them in that range during the fight to help protect them, because missiles do quite well against flying units. So those are the ways that you're going to want to position your units, why, and how you can use just this little hover here that I call the cheese check to give you a lot of information about your opponent's army. So check for that cheese, and if you just remind yourself, I just say in my head at the beginning of every battle, cheese check, and that reminds me, go right up here and see what I'm going up against. I hope this helps you guys out in the deployment phase and helps you to lay out your armies in a way that's going to bring you success and give you as much information about your opponent and what he may or may not be bringing, so that you are more effective in each and every battle. If you liked the video, enjoyed it, if it helped you out, please like, please subscribe so we can keep this coming out to you. I really do appreciate all the support I'm getting and any support that you provide in the future. So until the next time, this is the Magnus. Good luck on the ladder. Take care.